a.m. We're going to wait just a minute here. Tom Nichols is on his way to join us. We got to let some Zoom and YouTube stuff populate. Just bear with me for about 10 or 15 seconds, then we're going to get the show rolling. All right. Tom is on his way in. He'll be here in a moment. Hello, friends. Welcome to all of our Bulwark Plus members. I'm glad that you guys came and are spending a difficult night with us. We're going to want to do questions for us and for Tom later on in the show. So please go ahead and use the Q&A button for questions down at the bottom of the Zoom. Don't put them in the general chat. That'll get lost. I just want to say this has been a very emotional 48 hours or so. Please be extra gentle with one another in the chat tonight. There's a lot going on. We are entering what could be a very dark period for the country and the world. So take care of each other. I also want to welcome everybody else. This is the first time we've ever opened up our Thursday Night Bulwark live stream to the rest of the world. We're doing it only because there's a war and we think this is important, and we wanted people to be able to hear Charlie and Bill and Tom. So if you are listening to us on YouTube, you don't have access to the chat. I'm sorry. You don't have access to the Q&A. I'm sorry. That's only for Bulwark Plus members. Maybe we'll get that fixed at a later time. Maybe you'll decide to join Bulwark Plus. This is a work in progress for us. I am, for anybody who doesn't know, I'm JVL. I'm the editor of the Bulwark. I'm joined tonight by my colleagues, Charlie Sykes and Bill Crystal. And we are joined by our friend, Tom Nichols. Tom is a former professor at the Naval War College, a Russia expert. He writes the absolutely indispensable Peacefield newsletter for The Atlantic, which is really, really good stuff and ought to be on everybody's reading list. I hope you guys are all reading that every day and are signed up for him. He's also an all-around good guy. Tom, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thanks for the kind words. It's great to be with you guys.
Yeah, that all-around good guy thing. I mean, I don't know. We should discuss that. Maybe at the end of the show we can discuss that a little bit.
He was pushing it there.
There are 2 points of view. There are 2 points of view on that.
We want to present both sides. So I just, as a quick roadmap for people on how I want to spend our time together tonight, I want to start really, really close with the immediate stuff that's going on right now, and then slowly zoom out and take a longer and longer lens view. And so I'm going to try to structure our discussion that way. So Tom, let's just start with you, starting with now. What are the prospects for the Ukrainian resistance?
That's a great question, because I kind of thought the Russians were going to go in a little heavier than they've been going in. They seem to be, this seems to, I mean, again, and we're doing this on the fly, long distance. So it looks like they're not just, trying to flatten everybody in their path. But it depends on what the Russians are going to try and do. If they try and set up garrisons and just occupy and hold the country, then the Ukrainian resistance is going to be really busy, and they'll do pretty well. If this is just a kind of lightning in and out, which I don't think it is, then I think this becomes there doesn't have to be a resistance. There's still going to be Ukrainian military that can fight, but I'm still trying to get my head around what the Russian battle plan is here. Are they just going to go into Kiev and try and replace, literally like pull one government out like a plug and play and just put another one in there? Are they trying to hold all the major cities? This clearly had a lot of forethought and planning to it, but I'm still trying to kind of piece together the logic of this invasion, because I'm not quite sure what Putin thinks he's doing, especially after the 2 speeches. Just to leave aside the resistance for a minute, these 2 speeches that Putin gave in the day, 2 days ago, I mean, they were weird. They were kind of unhinged. So I'm not quite sure what the link here. I taught strategy for a lot of years. Strategy is about linking means to and ways to ends, and I'm not sure I see how he's doing that yet. So that has a lot to say about the chances of the resistance, because it depends, if Putin's just going to put his people out there and just kind of make them hold posts, that's going to get pretty dicey for the Russians in short order.
So could I ask a question? JVL wrote about this about a week ago, the danger of the fog of war and disinformation. As we're watching in real time, how do we know what's true and what's accurate? For example, a lot of speculation. Have the Ukrainians retaken the airport from the Russians, which would be big if it's true? So when you're filtering the information that comes out of the region, how do we figure out what's credible, what's not credible, what's believable, because there's so much chaff out there?
Yeah, I mean, well, for starters, and this is good advice to everybody, YouTube and TikTok are not reliable sources.
Really?
I mean, there are Russian soldiers apparently posting TikToks, which is crazy. But I mean, I really don't know how to vet that kind of information yet. But I just assume the first report I hear of it, when I heard, for example, Charlie, they've retaken the airport, I said, I have no.
Right.
I didn't even comment on it. I mean, that could be Ukraine. That could be Ukrainians. It could be true.
Right.
But it could also be Ukrainians saying it to, bolster spirits. It could be the Russians saying it so they can justify going heavier. I mean, there's too many pipelines of information. So I personally am waiting for official sources that are vetting, either reputable journalists, the Pentagon, foreign military organizations. But I empathize with all the people who aren't. I mean, I'm supposed to be an expert in this stuff, and I can't tell the wheat from the chaff this early.
I mean,
Tom, what is? I'm sorry. Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, just two things I'd say. I mean, look, also wars are very dynamic. They change. They look very difficult, and then something happens, and they pivot very quickly. They look very easy, and something happens, and they get very difficult. And so a lot of this is sort of people are a little too used to things going in a straight line, like it's some congressional vote, and are they at 44 votes or 48 votes or 52 votes? But I was there in the White House in 1991. We all Afghanistan at the beginning looked bad. Remember that the first 2-3 weeks? Oh my God! Then total collapse, looked incredibly easy. Then a couple of years later, not so easy. I mean, so I think it's just people need to kind of step back a little, and it's going to be complicated and contingent. We just don't know. I mean, a lot depends on the individual's decisions of battlefield commanders and of course Putin himself and Zelensky and other things, what we're doing covertly maybe in terms of some disinformation or messing up their own command structure and command and control. I mean, who knows? It is just the nature. It's not just the information problem, which is already a problem. It's the nature of war. I'd say. I do think on the strategy point, the one point I think, Tom, we've all made this point actually is, I mean, it was clear to me several weeks ago, and the reason I always thought Putin would go in big, he cannot afford to have a pro-Western government remaining in Kiev. I mean, that would be a defeat for him after everything he's done, and certainly after this last couple of days. He needs to have some either weaken the country radically so it's split, and so he has won in that way, and or a puppet government there, and or all the way to absorption of Ukraine, I suppose. So I think that keeping that in mind, I mean, that's got to be, he's not, whatever one can say about Putin and his weirdness and stuff, he's not foolish in that way. He knows that that's what he has to have at the end. The dash to the airport, people, near Kiev, people are saying, well, that was maybe militarily risky or a gamble or maybe foolish. But on the other hand, from his point of view, if there was a 20% chance of just decapitating the government real quickly and getting them without their guard up, maybe it's worth it. And now he has to regroup, and there'll be 2 days of him not doing so well and then doing better. So anyway, it just, these things are as you guys well know, they're more dynamic than one thinks.
Bill, on the first point, as you were talking about Afghanistan, and I was over on the Hill during Desert Storm, and the Russian Public Affairs Office doesn't have an embed. The people that are there, I was watching one foreign correspondent saying, well, those guys have the orange and black armbands, so those are Russian forces. And I thought, maybe. But the other thing about the strategy point, I mean, I agree with you. He cannot, I think Ann Applebaum's been right about this all along too, that he cannot tolerate 40 million Slavs practicing democracy next door. On the other hand, if he's really going to replace the regime, then he is going to have, this goes back to Charlie's point about the resistance. He's going to have to stay there, or he's going to have another Maidan on his hands where they're going to run the guy out of town. I mean, he can't just put some stooge, in the palace and then go home and say, one and done, because the Ukraine, I don't think the Ukrainians, I guess part of my problem is that I'm part of this minority, and I'm glad to say that Lawrence Friedman and a few other people are in this same camp. I don't think Putin's a very good strategist. I mean, we've built him up to be this kind of strategic genius. He's a chess player. Gary Kasparov keeps saying he's not a chess player. He's Gary Kasparov knows a thing or two about chess.
But Gary's point, Tom, which is interesting, so I think agrees with you, but also cuts a little, is I remember I did the conversation with Gary 4 or 5 years ago where he made this point very strikingly. He's not a chess player, but he's a poker player, which is, and he's had successes, but poker players can be successful up to a point, and then their biggest bluff gets called, right? So I think it's a bit, but I think it's a shrewd point of Gary's that the chess metaphor is all wrong. The clever thinking ape moves ahead, and
the brainiac of the Kremlin. And no, there's a lot of stuff he's doing that is like Saddam Hussein, right? Saddam's a wily survivor. Well, that was true right up until the moment they hung him. But I think there was a lot of talk today about, is Putin rational? Right. He is rational, but he's not only in the sense that he has orderly preferences that he's acting on, but I'm not sure that he's really in touch with reality. I mean, I think if he thinks he's going to go in, implant a government, and then go home, then he's going to be right back where he started.
He's in a bubble, right? I mean, he has a very, very small circle of people that he bullies and he browbeats. We saw that earlier this week.
That was a remarkable piece of film. That's when I first started to get that kind of creepy feeling in the pit of my stomach. Where,
what did you see?
Pardon?
Yeah, tell me what you saw when you watched that.
The guy, the poor son of a bitch that was standing there stammering, is the equivalent of the Russian head of the CIA, the Foreign Intelligence Service, and Putin saying, "So what do you think I ought to do?" And the guy's going, ha 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 ha. What am I supposed to say? And then he says, "Why, yes, we should recognize." And he says, and Putin, really in a derogatory kind of chuckling, and he says, and kept saying, speak directly, speak plainly, speak up, and the guy kept stammering. And then Putin said, "Yeah, that's not the thing we're talking about. Like, you don't get where I'm trying to go with this." They all sat there like it was an audience with the Pope. That wasn't a cabinet meeting. That was a regal, audience. And so that's when I started to say, this guy is isolated. The rumor mill for years has been that he is now very tight with some very right-wing Russian Orthodox clerics who are basically.
I was going to ask you about this, about the rumor mill about the messianism of Putin's Orthodox. Is there anything to this?
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, I think
that's scary.
It's not
reassuring.
Charlie, when have I? Charlie,
that's not what we do on this show. We don't do reassuring.
No, I know. The only person that goes darker than me is JVL, who's sitting right here. But I'm feeling pretty dark about it myself, and that I heard years ago that he was basically, with these Orthodox priests who are basically saying, you are, you're basically Jesus Christ. You are the, God's chosen on earth. And when you start to believe that stuff,
I've heard that line before in politics.
Yeah.
So here's a question for you, Tom. I mean, not to go looking for bright signs, but were you surprised by the protests we're already seeing footage of in Russia?
Yeah.
Because every one of those people who is showing their face, they're not even masked. Like they're not covering their faces with scarves or anything. They're out in public. Those people are putting their lives in their hands on this.
I was not surprised by the sentiment. I'm surprised by how many people are willing to take the risk. So, I mean, the idea I mean, I always assumed that this war would be unpopular. And that's why I was, that's why I've been kind of wrestling with this kind of what's Putin's end game here, because the Russian public's going to get tired of this pretty fast because they think of these people as their brothers and sisters. There's a huge amount of intermarriage between Russians and Ukrainians. They're like a fifth of the city of Kiev is Russian. So that people are like shocked that he would do this in such an open way. This is what I mean. Charlie, this goes back to the bubble question. It's like, how did you not understand that your own people feel this way about Ukraine? Your own people are not sitting around saying, oh, is Ukraine really going to join NATO? And are there going to be F-16s flying, over the Dnieper? But I am surprised at how many people are basically risking their lives to go into the streets because Putin does not like this stuff.
These are big crowds, right? I mean, we're talking about the fog of disinformation, but the pictures that I'm seeing, they look like really.
Yeah, those are photoshopped.
Okay, so
right,
this is actually happening.
Yes, and we know from experience, Putin really hates this stuff.
Yeah,
back. I mean, remember, part of his animus about Hillary Clinton is that he thought she was, creating these crowds and protests against him. He hates these public protests with a passion. So this has got to be, again, you're looking for a bright spot. I see it as another dark problem that if he starts to feel embattled and isolated, it's going to get worse.
Okay, what does that mean?
People,
worse,
I mean, the Russian. I see two of the bright spots, though they can have bad short-term consequences, as you say, Tom. The Ukrainian people and the Russian people seem to actually be courageous. They like democracy and freedom. The Ukrainian people, hopefully impressive. Zelensky's been very impressive for all that he has an unorthodox background. We could debate whether he should have been, maybe he wasn't alarmed quite early enough. We didn't want to sound alarmed enough. And obviously we don't know enough to know if he really prepared the military well and so forth, or had his generals do so. But I've got to say, between Zelensky, the Ukrainian people, and at least some of the Russian people, it's given me, they seem to be like better on the democracy and leadership scale than some other countries one can think of, that are longer standing democracies here. I did a conversation actually with Ann Applebaum early this morning, which will be up, I don't know, very early tomorrow morning, I hope. And we were just talking about how, we've got our talk show. We had our talk show host as president. They had their kind of stand-up comic as president. They got the better end of it. They got the better of the deal,
But that's especially true in the cities. I mean, when you get away from the big cities, you do get some pretty scary politics out in the boondocks in Russia, and that has always been Putin's. Insofar as he needs a base of political support among the Russian population, it's kind of like the China and Tiananmen problem, right? That the kids in the cities are totally on board, but then they bring in the guys from the sticks who are definitely a lot more right wing. But I think you're right, Bill, that these are pretty resilient people who just I think Putin doesn't. I've said this for so many times over the years. Putin has never quite understood that the 21st century happened, and that these are not Soviet citizens who will simply meekly nod and go God rest his soul, P.J. O'Rourke, the Cold War ended because people didn't want to wear Bulgarian shoes. These are not people that are going to go stand in line for Bulgarian shoes and a moldy banana. But on the other hand, Putin will put a lot of people in jail if he has to. So this thing is going to get.
I don't mean to step on the one bright spot here, but you made a reference, and I heard somebody else, I think it was one of the NBC correspondents, saying, so if this thing turns bad for Putin and he's pushed into a corner, if there are a lot of casualties, if it doesn't go well, if there are mass protests, this could be dangerous. You said, sort of hinted at the same thing. What does that mean? What happens if he's pushed into a corner? What happens if things break bad for him?
I always, I feel like the ghost of Christmas yet to come. Doom.
How much
One
doom?
thing he could do, and I mentioned this in my piece in the Atlantic today. I mean, if this all goes south on him, he could say, you know why this is happening? You know who did this? The Biden administration. And so this is now between the United States and the Russian Federation. And he could do like we did in 1973. He could say, everybody calm down, or I'm going to go to a heightened state of nuclear alert, or I'm going to put my strategic forces on a higher footing, or I'm going to, really, I'm going to send in I'm going to go in a lot heavier with armor, and I'm going to start blowing things up left and right. He might do that. The idea that he will just kind of take it if things go bad on him. I've never seen a lot of evidence that he cares about cutting losses. And I think an earlier version of Putin. I mean, one of the things that the Russia expert, the Russia heads in the world I lived in for so long, that we've been debating for 20 years is, was he always like this, or did he change? And I think he has definitely, I've been watching the guy and listening to all his stuff for 20 years. I was a Putin optimist. I mean, they would have called, 20 years ago, you would have called me a Versteher, that I was like, give the guy a chance. He's actually doing some okay things. He doesn't, I think the past 10 years, especially, he has his paranoia and his kind of Soviet, Nikita Khrushchev once referred to himself, he did in his memoirs, he did something, he was talking about repressing a well-known scientist, and he said, that was Stalin belching inside me. And it seems increasingly like the old Soviet Union is like this reflux that has just come up more and more and more within Putin over the past few years. And so I think, the guy that we might have counted on to have a cooler head, 10 or 12 years ago, those two speeches he gave are really sticking in my mind, and they've really got me worried. That is not the guy that he was 10 years ago.
If things go bad or if things go well in a way, for him, it's not, he's got troops in Belarus that borders Lithuania and Latvia. Those are porous borders. Those are small countries. He doesn't have to invade them, but he can have little green men, and he can do disruption and cyber. And suddenly we have a sort of an attack and a sort of coup attempt in a NATO country. And Putin might think, I'm going to show them. They think that they can just defend NATO and I can't touch them. But are they really going to go to war? Can they even? Incidentally, Biden, a friend of mine who's very experienced in government, said one of the, given our cuts in defense, the fact that we no longer have a two-war strategy because that was obsolete in 2012. Yeah, right. Biden could call it. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs and say, okay, well, look, Lithuania looks like they're picking up some very bad signals. What can we do to actually defend Vilnius? And I think the chairman's going to say, well, that's pretty tough. Maybe if you want to escalate to threats of nuclear, no one wants to do that. And what about parts of Poland? The Poles are helping the Ukrainians. We need to do some stuff on the border. I think the one thing I would say, and I hope this doesn't all happen, and I don't think it will, but people are too unimaginative. About what happens once wars start. Things get out of control in one way or another. It could also end very quickly. It's not like it always gets worse. It's just that it's different from the scenarios one has in mind from peacetime, especially as we got so accustomed to peace. And even Putin's very bad things he did in 2008 and 2014 were limited and ultimately kind of settled down, you might say. And we ended up with, demarcation lines, that there was a tiny lot of, there was killing around them. I don't mean to minimize that, but it wasn't a truly out of control dynamic situation. And who knows with someone like Putin, as you say, Tom, and the kind of situation, the region, we're talking about, and the provocations that people could invent. And it is really the
nuke
moment,
thing,
I think.
And
we're very unused to. We're very unused to thinking in this way,
So, yeah.
The Baltic thing bothers me a lot, Bill.
Yeah.
Because that, I'm really worried that Putin will get it into his head to say, look, I think one of his overriding goals for years has been to break NATO, to just make it go away. And this, people can say, well, how come he didn't invade under Trump? Well, because under Trump, he was getting everything he wanted. Trump was doing it for him. But I think if I'm worried that if he gets desperate, he'll say, look, you know what? I'm not going to roll into Tallinn or Vilnius. I'm going to take a little chunk of it, and I'm going to sit on it to prove that Article 5 is nonsense.
Bullshit.
And then NATO meets and says, no, Article 5 actually means something. And I think the one game changer, and as you say, we can let our imaginations run wild. My imagination takes me to I once had a Russian diplomat say to me, we could have gone to, we could have gone through Germany in 7 days. We could have gotten to the Rhine and all. I said, but how are you going to get out?
Yeah.
And the problem is they could go into Lithuania, they could go into across the Baltics, but then NATO has other assets like air power that the Russians just can't even begin to touch. Then what happens when their guys are just sitting there getting their asses handed to them over and over again? And that's when Putin says, we have this thing about de-escalation and that, with tactical nuclear weapons. And the whole thing becomes, this is why I didn't, I started going down this road in the piece today, and I figured I was probably scaring people enough.
Yeah.
So I didn't go down this road. But and Bill, if we don't have that, then as I think Charlie, you were about to say it. Well, then, what does Biden do if a NATO member is invaded? Well, NATO is a nuclear alliance, and then we say, okay, here's the ultimatum. You have this many hours to turn your asses around and go home. And I don't even want to think about that happening. But it's. The level of uncertainty, like I said, Putin has put almost 190,000 guys in motion in the middle of Europe. Bad things can happen that we can't even foresee. There are black swans being hatched everywhere right now. Who's I don't know where I'm going with that metaphor. Whose eggshells we don't know about and whose wings have not spread yet. But there's all kinds of unpredictable things that are lurking out there right now.
You're depressing
Tom,
even JVL.
No. This is all.
That's not possible.
All good. So I want to talk a little bit about NATO responses, and I think there is this logical fallacy that if the response isn't perfect, then it means it's an utter failure, and why are we even trying? Right? You see a little bit of that. I do trend to think about our responses in a series of tranches, right? I mean, they're the things we should be doing tomorrow, or things we should be doing today, things we should be doing 4 weeks from now, things we should be doing 4 months from now, et cetera. So when you talk about the Baltics, this is where my obsession on this has been, like yours, that what he wants to do is break NATO. The way to do that is to trigger an Article 5 crisis and then dare some of the treaty signees to not respond. So it seems that it is really important to create a tripwire across the Baltics, of NATO troops, so that in order to get to squat on a piece of land, he has to shoot at a bunch of Germans and Americans, right? And so I guess when you start thinking about what the proper response is of NATO over the, what they should do tomorrow, what they should do 4 weeks from now, what we should be doing 4 months from now, what are you looking at? And beyond the idea of sanctions, I think people are fixated on sanctions because it's like a button that we think we can just push. Oh, sanctions, make the sanctions go. But
they almost
never.
I shouldn't say never, but they almost never work.
Well, and maybe they can be helpful. They are a tool that you can use, but it isn't like a self-destruct button that you push the sanctions button and then Putin blows up. So what is when you look at that, what should NATO's response be over these, again, immediate, near, and further term?
Well, your idea of a tripwire, I've been arguing for years that we need to have some kind of American presence, American, British, German, core old NATO presence in the new NATO countries. One of the things that people I didn't think it was a great idea to start doing missile defense in the Czech Republic and Poland. I thought that was I'm not a big fan of missile defense. I thought it was provocative, but the one thing the new Europeans, the East Central Europeans, are absolutely right about. They were like, look, we don't really care if these bases work. We don't care if these missile interceptors work. We care that there will be Americans manning them in our country. And that I always agreed with, that there needed, because the Russians, you can tell them all day long that Lithuanians are members of NATO. Guys like Putin will say, well, we'll see about that when the bullets fly. He's a lot less likely. He's pretty sure that if he's going to overrun a base near the Lithuanian border and there are Americans in it, that he understands that. That goes back to the old Soviet times of, Russian and American forces need to stay far away from each other. So I think that's something we should have been doing. And I think, rather than kind of surging forces into it, because again, that's, the one thing the Russians are very good at is using everything as a pretext. this thing in Ukraine is going to play out over time, but there should be U.S., British, German forces stationed in new NATO. The time for debating whether or not we should have made these countries NATO members is long gone now. And we've committed to this. And so I think, that's something we should do. I also think, continuing to invest in, as I was saying to Bill a minute ago, things like air assets and other things that are particularly difficult and for the Russians to overcome. And the Russians are good at being on the ground and, breaking stuff. They are still overmatched against us when it comes to other forms of warfare, particularly in the air. So I think we can probably do those things slowly and prudentially over time.
Did we make a mistake by pulling our guys out of Ukraine? Though there were American troops there. Did we make them? We had people in the embassy. There was some criticism that we pulled everybody out. Would Putin slow down if he knew that the Americans were still there in the embassy in Kyiv?
No. I think keeping the Colorado National Guard, in a training mode somewhere in Ukraine, I think Putin's answer to that, understandably, would have been, you're not here in an official capacity. You're not part of the fighting. You're not an ally. So you either need to go home or get out of the way, or you're gonna get hurt. And so I don't think that would have really complicated his planning.
Good.
That's just I just did a segment with Anatol Levin, who had a great line. He said, until we either see a lot of declassified documents or get inside Putin's head somehow, we may never know exactly what provoked this particular kind of operation.
All right. Medium run. Who's next? Is it Moldova or Georgia?
I think
right. I've always thought there was a bridge between this and the Baltics. I assume that there would be another action as he tests the right, because what he's constantly doing is probing, like a poker player, right? You're probing for weakness, seeing how the guy sitting across from you is going to respond with his chip stack. So I figure this is one test. It's a very big test, but he'd won another one. He'd won another piece of confirmation before he really undertook his Article 5 test.
Well, there's a breakaway pro-Russian republic in Moldova. That's low-hanging fruit to say, hey, while I'm out there defending the interests of Russians, there's some over here. And that, there's been a long-standing problem there. That would be my guess. Assuming that, again, that things don't go sour in Ukraine and he has to somehow go home, when the body bags start to pile up.
Don't you think
what is medium,
estimating the he just in the last month, so without anyone noticing, he's got troops permanently stationed now in Belarus, which he didn't before, which is a pretty big country and pretty strategically located. I don't know a heck of a lot about it, honestly. But I don't know. It just feels to me like that's kind of a big, if he can succeed in Ukraine, even with some, nasty kind of guerrilla warfare and insurgency and not occupying even all of it, at some point he can look up and say, look, I extended Russia's borders hundreds of miles west, Belarus and Ukraine. I restored, made Russia great again. These were the two Soviet republics that were, I think, had their own seats, right, in the UN Security Council,
Ukraine and Belarus,
in the UN General Assembly.
Yep.
And, he's sort of they will then apply the stooge governments there, the Vichy type governments, to be part of the new Russian Federation, conceivably. You can imagine this in Putin's head, I do think, is part of the making Russia great again thing. And that might be, but Charlie's right. Then who knows what's next? Beyond that even. But the Belarus thing, I think, has gotten a little too little attention, maybe.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, but that's, the Belarus thing, they've been a de facto union for years. Even, I don't think I've been to Moscow in a decade, but, there was like a separate line. It was like the EU, like the evil EU line, right? Where if you had Russian and Belarus passports, you could go over here. The Russians were actually holding that relationship a little bit at arm's length because they didn't want to have to get stuck propping up the Belarusian currency. Belarus was all, but Lukashenko was all about, let's be, basically just part of this Russian Confederation.
They didn't have troops,
yeah. Well, but Moscow was like, okay, but that, that means we're not going to like be your checking account because your currency, if I recall, they used to call the Belarusian currency the Zaychik, which means little bunny, which tells you, how they kind of regard them. But stationing troops there, it's a permissive environment, is my point.
Yeah.
And Belarus is Russia's only friend in the world, two dictators backing each other up, but it does extend Russia's military reach further toward NATO. I was less concerned about that simply because Russia and Belarus have been jointly exercising war games for years. I think, now the other thing, Bill, I suspect some of those forces are there to tell Lukashenko, you're not going to get overthrown.
Yeah.
Not on our watch. You're not going to be East Germany. One thing Putin is absolutely firm on is that when I hate the Hitler comparisons, but the one thing he and Hitler had in common, they stand by their allies. We always, when we're teaching history to military officers, we say, Hitler was a great ally. He never forgot Mussolini, and he always stood with his guys. Putin's kind of the same thing. His word to people like Assad and Lukashenko and others is, if I say I'm backing you all the way. So I think that may be part of it as well.
It's interesting. I had this on my list of things to talk with you about. We brushed on the nuclear question a little bit, but I want to ask a more global, maybe even like theological question about the Russian approach to nuclear weapons. My understanding from my very layman's view of it is that nuclear weapons are in American military doctrine almost like a separate class, right? It's just a whole other kind of strategic weapon. Whereas in Russian doctrine,
NATO nuclear planners, American nuclear planners and NATO once refer to themselves as the crazy aunts in the attic.
Right. Whereas in Russian doctrine, it's more like, that's just another form of artillery, right? It's another thing you can use. Is there truth to that or no?
That it's truth that they like to be perceived that way. But one of the things we learned, and nobody played that game better than the Soviet Union. We lost 27 million people. You destroy cities, and we should, even now, one of my Russian friends a few years ago on VE Day said, remember, we're the people that drove Hitler to suicide. This very stoic kind of, we can.
Well, they have a point.
But what we found out at the end of the Cold War was that Soviet generals were they were about as sanguine as are. I mean, because we've had crazy American generals too, who said, we can fight a nuclear war, but they were a lot less stoic about it behind closed doors. There's a great, and I'll just tell you two quick stories. There's a great story about Brezhnev being walked through his nuclear release exercises. And, just because you do this with leaders, because you don't want to have to explain it in the middle of a crisis. And we do it in the United States. They did it there. And literally, when they told him to, turn this key in this briefcase, his hand was shaking. And he kept saying, this is an exercise, right? This is really just an exercise. And I mean, the whole thing just scared him shitless. Good. Now, with that said, I once interviewed the late General Guriev, the guy that was like the ops planner for Afghanistan when he was a retired 4-star. And after about 2 hours with Guriev, I had a Russian friend with me helping to translate. I turned in the street and I said, he'd have done it, wouldn't he? And my Russian pal was like, oh yeah. And that is,
yikes. Exactly.
On the other hand, I have met some American officers where I've thought,
but the flip side of it is, just to be technical,
Mike Flynn.
Our doctrine was that we would use tactical nuclear weapons if necessary. No first use was never the doctrine, which is which is the total separation of nukes, was not our doctrine. And Henry Kissinger, first became famous, as a strategist, because he said, look, we got to have integrated tactical nuclear weapons. I think it was always sort of talk more than anyone really getting their head around using them, hopefully. And maybe that was. But so I do think people have sort of but people have a rosy memory of the Cold War was this kind of nuclear showdown, but of course no one ever used them.
Yeah.
And then we did a lot of jousting at the kind of lower level. But our actual doctrine was, if they came across in Germany, that this was at least something that had to be done. And Reagan went to some trouble to preserve that against a lot of domestic opposition in the 80s and so forth. So, which I think is relevant today, in that we sort of, again, we don't realize how your point about Europe, I think, is so important, Tom. 190,000 troops unleashed in Europe. I mean, that has never been stable. We maintained the Cold War peace for 40 years, but that was a lot of work, and it was a lot of real big nuclear deterrence. And it was never like an easy thing to do. It was intrinsically difficult to do because Russia is so big and was there, and our allies don't, for reasons good and bad, have those kinds of militaries and stuff. So this is where, if you get into real military back and forth in Europe, it is not as if, well, it's just going to settle down to kind of a stalemate. That's kind of what happens in Europe. Well, it is happening in Europe in 1915, I guess, but it's not. Anyway, I think it is part of the intrinsic instability of the situation.
I want to foot stomp your point about our nuclear doctrine, which is that we not only said that, but we placed nuclear weapons specifically close up and told the Soviets, if you invade, you are going to overrun these positions.
Right. Well, that was the whole demonstrations in Europe in the late 70s, early 80s, right? I mean,
we basically said to them, we will have to use these weapons because you will actually overrun them. They are that close to the border. The only difference, and again, I just don't know how kind of full of crap the Russians are or aren't about this, that the Russians have kind of adopted a Russian version of the old NATO strategy of saying, if we're losing and if the shit's hit the fan and we're in trouble, we reserve the right to use tactical nuclear weapons to kind of force everyone to de-escalate, which is like the mirror image of our old NATO flexible response strategy. The difference is we had that strategy while never assuming that we were going to be the aggressors. Right. And the Russians are basically saying, if we attack you and we screw it up, we reserve the right to do this, to get ourselves out of a jam of our own making. Now, would they do it? I'm really intrigued by the defense minister, because he was one of the people sitting in that meeting the other day, just kind of looking like, man, this is not my cup of tea. But I have heard for years that Putin has deep curiosity about nuclear release procedures. Now, that would be people spreading rumors to kind of, so that stupid Russianologists like me will tell stories about it. On the other hand, he does spend a lot of time saying, and remember, Russia's a big nuclear power.
All right. We're going to get to questions in a minute. One quick thing before we get there, though, Tom. Can you give me just a couple things that you think Biden has done well so far in this crisis, and then a couple things that he needs to do better?
The thing he's done the best is something that I haven't seen done before. He has really taken risks with exposing what American intelligence knows about what's going on in Russia. And he has used that to strategic advantage of basically saying, I know that you're planning to attack in this place and time, doing this kind of thing. And that I think has been I've really been impressed by that, because no one likes to do that, because you're constantly risking exposes all of us have worked in the government, right? Sources and methods and, classified upon classified. But I think Biden really did that well. The thing he could do better is, the press conferences, I think, get a little rambling sometimes. This isn't the time to come out and have, I think he's gotten better over the past few days, but some of the messaging has been, I think, at times shaky, which I think is almost kind of just endemic to Democratic administrations sometimes. I mean, haven't seen a lot of, Blinken has finally kind of stepped forward. They've kind of kept the vice president, over to the kind of out of the spotlight on this. But more of the kind of stuff we saw from the president today rather than, a week or two ago. But the use of intelligence, I mean, I'm almost nitpicking at this point, because the use of intelligence and the clear warning, there was one of the administration guys today took a victory lap. I was listening on the radio, so I couldn't figure out who it was. He basically said, look, I wish I'd been wrong. I think it was Ned Price. He said, I wish we'd been wrong. He says, but the fact is we've been right on everything, every step of the way. And, that's credibility that you can bank when you've been doing that consistently for a few weeks.
Did I weigh in on this though? I mean, at some point, one of the jobs of the president is to mobilize public opinion, to explain to the American people why this is in the national interest. He hasn't done that yet. He hasn't used the bully pulpit. He hasn't addressed the nation. He hasn't made a concerted attempt. I mean, it's basically, look, I mean, how many of these 2:00 in the afternoon press conferences do we need? The second thing, and I know probably JVO, you want to get into this in more detail. The more I read about the sanctions that were issued today, the more breathtakingly inadequate they seem. And I'm specifically not referring to the failure to use SWIFT, which apparently, it was not going to happen, but the very explicit carve out of Russia's energy income, basically saying, we're going to sanction you, but we're going to make sure that this doesn't affect your ability to sell oil and to make lots of money. Well, that's basically the Russian economy. So how do you have credible sanctions if you basically say, yeah, we're not messing with the energy sector?
I'm not going to defend Biden on this. I'm going to say only that if I'm trying to disentangle that decision, I suspect that part of what he's trying to do is not hurt the average Russian.
I get, well, or our price of our oil.
But that part about our people, part of the problem with Democratic messaging, I think that too many Democrats, this is where former Republican, I've jumped the wall, I'm a defector, I'm a traitor. I think the Democrats have internalized too many of the Republican critiques about them. Mm-hmm. That they have come to believe that, we really can't make this argument about NATO and Ukraine because everybody hates NATO and nobody cares about this and no one could ever care about it. And they don't, all they care about is the price of a gallon of gas. And we can never make these arguments because on Fox, they're going to tear us apart. And Tucker Carlson's going to, lose his mind. They really need, and I've said this to Democrats, I'm like, you need to, be as forceful in your messaging. Don't worry about what they're going to say. You've become the abused spouse who really believes that you're fat and ugly and that nobody will ever love you. Just get out. The president needs to get out there. The one line I wish Joe Biden would use is something that a lot of us who work on this stuff have been saying. You don't want to live in a world where Russia makes the rules about who's a state. It's that simple. If you're an American and you like the fact that the international system provides you a high standard of living and free movement and freedom of information and all the other things that we used to defend during the Cold War, then you have to take a stand to say that the Russians and the Chinese, right now you live in a world that is governed by the Washington Consensus. You don't want to live in a world under the Beijing and Moscow rules. It's that simple. And the president of the United States can easily make that case, but I think they're just terrified of doing it because they're worried that, Laura Ingraham's going to sneer and curl her lip, which she's going to do no matter what you say. So maybe I do have a gripe about Democratic messaging. So
Question from Travis. Travis wants to know, why aren't we shipping javelins and stingers to the Ukrainian military now, before the invasion force cuts off the significant port and border access, and it becomes difficult to do later on?
But we've been shipping them javelins and stuff. I'm not sure I understand the question. I mean, it's been going on.
Tell me, maybe this is a misconception.
I mean, they have them, and we've been sending them, and it's not going to be hard. I mean, getting stuff across the border in the West to the Ukrainian military is not going to be hard. I mean, this isn't like D-Day where they're going to cut off Calais and we can't get anything in there. So I'm not concerned about that. The problem is that we should have been, and I'm going to say something critical of the Ukrainians here. We should have been doing this a lot earlier, but the Ukrainians it took the Ukrainians a long time to get their internal house in order.
Mhm.
There was a little sniping back and forth between the Balts and the Ukrainians about stuff like this. And the Balts, I think, have made the point that, hey, when we got free of the Soviet Union, the first thing we did for 15 years was build stable governments and modern militaries. And for the first 15 years of independence, Ukraine was all over the place. So it took us a while to get up to speed on that. There were issues about Russian sensibilities, but that's happening now. So I'm not sure that's an issue right now.
All right. Question from Maria, who wants to, we touched briefly on this, but not the specific question. What is the response within the Russian Orthodox Church been, right? Because this has essentially become a state-controlled church, right? I mean, not explicitly, but functionally. Have they said anything, or are they also concerned about denazification of Ukraine? Or
there has been no love lost between the Orthodox and Ukrainian Russian Orthodox churches over time, but I do not know of any statements from the Patriarchate in Russia yet. But they don't have a problem with Putin. Putin has positioned himself as a champion, and frankly, the thing, like the Russian dissident movement has not helped itself. I mean, I'm Orthodox. When Pussy Riot went into the Church of the Savior, and raised hell, I was like,
not helpful,
not helping. Sorry. And it makes it easy for Putin to position himself as defender of all things good and holy at that point. But I don't know yet what the Russian Orthodox Church has said or done about this invasion.
All right. So here's a question for all three of you from Peter, which is, do Finland, Sweden go and join Austria now? And I'm gonna tack onto this my own question, which is that I've seen a lot of people saying, "Oh, what do you guys think about all these rounds of NATO expansion?" And I look at this and I feel as though all of the talk of NATO, all the expanding that NATO did, turns out to have been one of the smartest things we've ever done. And thank God we did expand it to bring in these new members and give some protection. So, what do you think about Sweden and Finland? And then tell me if I'm crazy about that it was really important that we did expand NATO.
Well, I guess I'll start and say, I think that if that happens now, and Finland and Sweden just say we're in, the Russians will have to take it. But I also think that they will lose that at least the kind of Putin clack will lose its mind. This will confirm every fear they've ever had that they are totally encircled. And it's one thing to talk about, well, the Slovaks have joined NATO. Well, okay, great. It's another thing. The Finns, they know, there is a history there. And
hell of a history.
that's a pretty tough bunch of guys. So I think that would definitely get their attention. Now, with all that said, JVL, I was one of the go slow guys back in the mid 90s. Because I was worried about crippling kind of the Russian democratic and liberal movement with handing this, and I think especially the way we did it with Madeleine Albright, basically who gives a, fuck what the Russians think. But I also agree with you that the guy that finally talked me into NATO expansion as a good thing in itself, and that should be done more, was Vladimir Putin.
Yep.
And this is what I mean about not being a good strategist. I mean, no one has made a case for NATO expansion better than Vladimir Putin. And so I was, I've been wrong about a bunch of things lately. And that was one thing. I think going slow at the beginning, and I think doing it with a bit less haughtiness, the way the Clinton administration did, would have been better and might have strengthened some of the Atlanticists that were in the Russian leadership at the time. But in the end, no one has made the case for NATO expansion better than Vladimir Putin.
Charlie and Bill?
Well, I defer to Tom on that question. I have to say that in the last 24 hours, I have been blown away by the courage of countries like Finland and Sweden, who are right there. And so you think what it must be like to be the prime minister of Finland, who is issuing a statement, denouncing the Russian aggression when she's right on the border there. So I also think that, as we wake up today, if we hadn't expanded NATO into the Baltic states, they'd be screwed. I mean, think about what would be going. Yeah, what would the future of Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania be if we had not expanded NATO? So Tom's point that Vladimir Putin has made this eloquent case for, if you really want to contain him, you have to expand it, because look, what are we faced with right now? We are sitting here helplessly watching him swallow Ukraine, and Ukraine, brave Ukraine, despite all of the rhetoric and all of the support and the sanctions and everything, they're fighting alone right now. Nobody's coming to their defense, and Vladimir Putin is seeing that opening and saying, if you don't expand NATO, I'm going to swallow you up. But obviously, Tom's also right that this will trigger them. My response is, at this point, fuck them. If they lose their shit, they lose their shit.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, what are they going if we expand NATO, what are they going to do? Start invading their neighbors? Oh, well.
Yeah. Well, exactly. That's kind of it.
We're already,
So here's a question from Golden Rule Lover, which is, I'm assuming, not his or her real name. How does regime change happen in Russia? So this is, does this happen just when Putin decides to hand things over, or is it like Death of Stalin? We got to wait for Putin to keel over, or does he get pushed out, or is there? My friend Ben Parker has commonly said that written a couple good pieces for us about how, in a lot of ways, Putin is the bridge holding it all together, and that it isn't obvious how you could replace him, and that every new Russian leader essentially creates an entirely new regime, so that the next head of Russia, is going to create a whole new system in some way.
Yeah, this regime ends in a Kremlin hospital when Putin. Putin's 69, which by Russian
standards, be around a while. Yeah.
But by Russian standards, that's, they're in dog years. I mean, that's an old guy in a country where male life expectancy is like 57. On the other hand, the oligarchs around him and the elites around him, they're his creatures. They're made guys. So when you're looking at this and say, well, no one's ever going to overthrow him. Well, that's true structurally, that they're his capos and underbosses. On the other hand, Paul Castellano probably thought that right up until the moment they blew him away in the middle of the street in New York City and took out the head of, the 5 families. Could it happen? I sometimes think that I don't want to keep raising the nuclear specter, but if things get to that level of an intense crisis, I have wondered if there are people that were sitting in that room in that creepy video who look at each other and say, we have to, this guy thinks he's Jesus, and then, he's going to blow up the planet, and we have to do something about him. Can they, when the entire, secret police apparatus is pretty much, his personal guard? I don't know. There's just, I think that meeting really showed the degree, openly kind of mocking your own intelligence chief on national television really shows the depth of control that he has over these people now. So I think that he came back in 2008 for that third term because he made a decision. I think there was a moment of potential, like, I can do a Yeltsin, right? Turn it over to a guy who's going to protect me, and then I can go enjoy my money and be the world's richest man. But I think he made a decision that the only place he's safe is to be the president of Russia.
The regime changes, like what's the joke about bankruptcy, that it had to go bankrupt
and then
all at once. Slowly, and then all at once. Right. This is where he has taken a big. I always thought he would do this, because I think he was so fearful of a increasingly pro-Western Ukrainian government, and that he just couldn't afford that, and that's why I thought he would go big and not just take a little more Donbass or whatever. having said that, the people who said, well, no, that's awfully risky for him to do, they weren't foolish. They were, in fact, the majority, I would say, of actual Russian experts probably, who were sort of, geez, he's not that much a risk taker. It hasn't been in the past. And does he really, if you were a dictator and you started a foreign adventure and it goes badly, there's quite a lot of precedent for that maybe threatening your actual hold, and the oligarchs decide, and if we get serious about cutting down on the oligarchs over here and their kids can't go to the nice schools in England anymore and so forth. So I do think a lot more is on the table than one thought just 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I don't want to be too hopeful. He could be, unfortunately, dictator for 10 more years, obviously, and terrible things could happen, but it is a little more in play maybe than it was.
So could I just bounce this off you guys, because there's a tweet out from Hans Nichols who said that Kyiv is close to falling. Russian mechanized forces, which came in from Belarus, are 20 miles outside of Kyiv, according to the Secretary of Defense. So apparently Austin told members of the House that military officials looking at ways to provide more defensive equipment, but they're saying that the fall of Kyiv sounds like it's imminent. So your thoughts about that, Tom? So will Vladimir Putin, will that be the success that he needs to keep the momentum?
I am surprised that I was hoping that he was not going to literally try to drive into Kiev. And apparently last I'd heard is that it's in, and that may, if they're 20 miles outside the city, that may be, where now they're going to tighten that ring. But again, to do what? I think Putin does not want to have video of Ukrainians and Russians fighting house to house and, babushkas with AK-47s, defending their gardens from Cossacks. From Russian invaders,
bombing apartment buildings.
But if he's going to do regime change, well, he's got to go get the regime. And I think that's another place, Jonathan, when you asked about things Biden did, where he said they've got a list, they're going to start arresting people. Today, the administration said they are going to start engaging in large scale human rights abuses. And it looks like that's exactly the road they're going to go down.
Last question, and then we're going to let everybody go home. And this is from Karen. It's a good question for all three of you guys to chew over here for a little bit. What do we think the domestic politics of this are going to be like here in America? And this is a very, very astute question from Karen, and a good one, because all of the responses we've talked about, none of them are possible without domestic political support, right? The will of the people in a democracy is what determines the scope of the possible. So what do the three of you look at and see public opinion being on this over, again, the next week, 6 weeks, 2 years?
I'm going to defer to Charlie on this, because you made a great point this morning, Charlie, about the entertainment wing versus the elected wing of the GOP. I think most people are going to, are supportive of the president. They get it that Russians invading a country is bad. Okay. I think we still have enough of the old Cold War consensus to kind of get that point. I think the real question is, how difficult will the Republicans make that? And Charlie's point this morning, I thought, was kind of key on that. About
I want to refer to JVL, because he's written about this and he knows that we're basically an isolationist country. There's an isolationist consensus, and I think that's the real problem, is that neither political party has much of an appetite for the sort of the international leadership, right? JVL, that was the point of your article today in the Bulwark, that America needs to step up and act like grown-ups, and what's the evidence that we're capable of doing that right now?
I'm not.
Can I interject and say the evidence is the 1980s?
Well,
that's true
a little while
in
ago.
a way. And, this is, I would say the optimistic argument has always been America will become serious once the world demands it of us. Right. Yes. And we thought, look, if there's ever anything like a global pandemic, then we will be serious. We will stop being. That hasn't turned out. Maybe a European war. I don't know. But things do change, right? I mean, Bill, you're always going to be optimistic. You're going to, the new generation comes in, and, you really got to figure that these people, they don't have all of the built up layers of cant that the older folks have, and they'll rise to the occasion. Would you like to take that out for a spin here?
I'll close. I can close on that upbeat note. I believe that somewhat. Look, in 1947-ish, I would say, we couldn't get out of Europe fast enough. We were exhausted from World War II, kind of a big war, legitimate. We had a right to be exhausted. People wanted to get back to, enjoy the GI Bill and have kids and all this sort of thing. And then from 48 to 50, what do we do? Berlin airlift, the least of it. And then, of course, Korea and the huge military buildup, the whole creation of the modern national security structure and so forth. And no one would have predicted that, honestly, not very many. Churchill gave that speech in 46, the Iron Curtain speech. It was because he was sort of not despairing, but very much thinking that people were not alert to the danger. So things can change. Democracies can pivot. In a funny way, for all the talk about how they're so slow to move compared to dictatorships, democracies can move pretty fast one way or the other, for better or worse, incidentally. I do think we paid a huge price for basically 12, 13 years of nation building begins at home. We can't do this foreign adventurism stuff. We can't promote democracy. We can't be the world police. But there was the Obama version of it. There was the Trump version of it, a little bit of the Biden version of it in Afghanistan. Well, not a little, because Afghanistan was the Biden version of that. How much that's sunk in, how much that can be shaken off by Tom's excellent formulation that, look, this is it, man. We are living in a world that's basically still American Washington rules, and that's a good world for the US, and a world of Russia and China rules. That is just terrifying. And but I think the president needs to and others, members of Congress could do this, lay out. We need a Scoop Jackson, we need a John McCain, we need people like that. Lay out what it would look like, nuclear proliferation, all kinds of,
tell the story.
So many things would change that we just take for granted as not, as being part of a reasonably peaceful and prosperous world that we're currently living in. So I think that's that is where the public education can change the public opinion, but people need to lead. They do need to lead. Right.
No, I'll end with one optimistic note and say I still I'm more toward Bill's side here. There's the one thing that you do find in polls is Americans still do support NATO, and by a majority, and to the point where even Donald Trump couldn't break that. That this was one place where, Trump got no traction with most of the public other than his fanboys about things like breaking NATO. So I, knock on wood and fingers crossed about that.
Great. Well, that's a good place to end. I want to thank all you guys, all the Bulwark Plus members in the chat. I have been keeping an eye on you, and I'm really proud of you guys. You built just a fantastic community, and I am honored by your support. Really and truly. For everybody else listening in on the live stream who over on YouTube, thanks for joining us. I hope you liked it. Next time, if you want to come inside onto the chat, you can do that too, hopefully. Tom, thank you for giving your time so generously here and sharing.
Thanks for having me, guys.
It's great. It. Charlie and Bill, thank you guys. Everybody, hang tough and go Ukraine.